This is another interview in the Byrne Archive Project, profiling the administration and career of Governor Brendan T. Byrne of New Jersey. It's February 2nd, 2006. This interview is with Louis B. Thurston III, and I am Don Linky, and I will be conducting the interview today. Lou, your career in New Jersey government and politics has now spanned some 4 decades, I guess. Before we get into the specifics, I think, of your various positions in the state government, in the legislature, and the executive, I thought it'd be helpful to get some overview of how you've seen sort of the New Jersey government and political structure, particularly in terms of the governor and the legislature, change given your career and involvement in various roles in the state government.
Well, back in the 1960s, the scale of everything was much smaller. The executive branch was much smaller. The legislature was actually smaller. There were only 21 members in the Senate and 60 members in the Assembly. And so that was one of the first differences. Everything was smaller in scope. There was less to deal with. It was less complicated. That was an important point. Beyond that, the governor still had his statutory and constitutional powers that make him the most powerful governor in the country. The legislature was rurally dominated in many respects and dominated by the Republican Party for most of the last 50 years before the 1960s.
What was the sort of differences in style in terms of how the governor related to the legislature in the early days compared to sort of your more active involvement during the Byrne and Kane administrations and maybe to present day?
Well, I think there was a collegiality that evidenced itself between the legislature and the governor. There were times publicly when they were very critical of each other, but there was an atmosphere in which they were able to work together. It was like after a basketball game, for instance, you would play hard and then you would go out and have a drink or have a dinner with your opponents. And so that kind of atmosphere prevailed, and the legislature was a very part-time body at that time. It only met once a week on Mondays and took the summer off. And so there was an informality, there was a collegiality that I think was lost over time in the next 30 or 40 years.
What are your recollections of the sort of first governors that you had any personal involvement with?
Well, the first governor I had direct involvement with was Governor Richard Hughes, who was a charming man, who was very resilient, came back from the defeats that he had, and had a very successful career for 8 years as governor. He was personally charming and got along well with many of the legislators, but he had to deal with a Republican Senate for most of the time that he was governor, and so there was a lot of interplay that had to go back and forth between the Democratic governor and the Republican legislature. He was succeeded by Governor William Cahill, who was a different kind of personality, a hard-charging lawyer, a somewhat of a no-nonsense kind of person, but who liked the administrative side of things and probably spent more time in the governor's office than any of his successors. Most of them have been out and about around the state doing various things, and so there's a very different style there. But personally, Governor Hughes and Governor Cahill got along very well and became good friends after a while.
In terms of how Governor Hughes and Governor Cahill dealt with the legislature, was it direct personal involvement where they would sort of lobby the legislative leadership or individual legislators? Did they rely on staff, or just how was their style similar or different?
I think there was a fair amount of direct involvement between them on important matters, and the legislative leaders. There were fewer legislative leaders in those days. There was a much smaller staff in both the legislature and the governor's office. And as a result, I think there was more direct contact between the governor and the legislative leaders, the elected legislative leaders.
Did you get a feel for whether the legislative leadership, at least on the Republican side, preferred to deal with Governor Hughes in terms of the sort of gregarious personality he had compared to subsequent governors who may have used staff intermediaries more?
Well, I think that the legislators enjoyed being able to deal directly with Governor Hughes. Governor Cahill had a different kind of personality, as I've indicated, but he still managed to get along well, although he relied a lot on the legislative leaders that he had in both the Senate and the Assembly at that time, who got along very well with him. And so he relied very heavily on people like Senate President Ray Bateman and Assembly Speaker Tom Kean to carry his legislative program.
Mm-hmm. In the sort of Hughes and Cahill administrations during the sort of legislative period, you mentioned a couple of the sort of significant leaders. Who were the other sort of personalities, either in leadership or out, who had significant influence, particularly on policy in those days?
Well, one of the most important differences in that respect was that the Secretary of State was the most powerful staff political person in those days. The incoming governor, whoever it was, usually appointed his chief political advisor as Secretary of State. In the case of Governor Hughes, that was a man named Bob Burkhart. In the case of Governor Cahill, was a person called Paul Sherwin. And they were close advisors politically and personally to the governors, and they were the ones who really they really were the predecessors of what today would be the chief of staff or chief counsel to a governor.
So I guess one of the sort of changes over time has been the sort of emergence of the staff as a more direct sort of conduit from the governor, where it used to be sort of significant cabinet people like the Secretary of State.
I think that's true, and over the last 30 or 40 years, the governor's staff has grown very significantly, as the whole scope of the state government and all of what it deals with has grown substantially. And likewise, the legislative staff has grown substantially too. So there's less direct involvement on a week-to-week, month-to-month kind of basis than there used to be.
Overall, do you think it's been a good or a bad thing with this sort of growth of the staff, both in the executive and the legislature? I think there are mixed opinions about that, but I'd be curious about your own thoughts.
Well, I think it was a necessary thing because the government basically got much larger and dealt with more of society's and the economy's problems, and so there needed to be more people to deal with it. But I was always in favor of a relatively lean operation with a relatively small staff of the governor and the legislature, and a reliance directly with the cabinet people who ran each of the state executive departments.
You think today it's now grown too large? Now, with the incoming Corzine administration, there have at least been announcements of significant cutbacks in the governor's staff. I haven't heard similar calls on the legislative staff, but we're in a time now of sort of fiscal retrenchment. So do you think the staffs have gotten too large in terms of efficiency and communication?
I don't think I'd have any problem with some cutbacks in the staff of the governor's office and probably the legislature as well. There is still a need for heavy staff work to process all the information that's necessary, but I think some cutback is appropriate. And of course, a number of those positions relate to political factors in the kinds of political activity that a governor might involve himself with, or the legislators might involve themselves with.
Okay. Before we move on to the Byrne and Kean administrations, I wanted again go back, I guess, to the Cahill-Hughes years. What are your sort of recollections of some of the significant issues that involved the legislature and the governor during those two administrations?
Well, fiscal issues always were something that everybody had to deal with. It was the annual budget. This was the days before the state had an income tax or a sales tax, and it relied for its revenues on excise taxes, taxes on cigarettes and gasoline and other things like that. So every year there was a battle over the budget, and the expenses always seemed to exceed the growth in expenses seemed to exceed the growth in revenues, and so the legislature and the governor always had to deal with those kind of issues. There were issues of infrastructure improvements for dollars for transportation, for colleges, that kind of thing. And in those days, there were bond issues that were put up for public approval on a regular basis. And so it was not unusual in a particular year that there would be one or more of those kind of bond issues that they would have to deal with. It was also a time when the problems of the cities were starting to emerge. And so there was a focus there on trying to help the cities and to also start to deal with urban education and education in particular, in the funding of education.
In terms of sort of the party cohesion, how much pressure was there in those days in terms of keeping discipline within the party on significant votes?
Well, there was a significant amount of activity related to party discipline. That was an important factor. We need to keep in mind that this was before the major changes we had in making the election districts for each of the members of the legislature equal in population, before the so-called one man, one vote mandates from the courts. And as a result, the districts were based on the counties, and the county political leadership in both parties was very strong and dominated that and dominated the nominating process for members of the legislature. As a result, the county political leaders had a great deal of power that they exerted relative to the members of the legislature.
And I guess it varied from county to county as to whether the county chairman or county boss, popularly called, directed the legislators from that district, as opposed to the legislator being, in fact, the county boss? Or was it more locally based in terms of the county chairman or the county or the sort of indirect county boss behind the scenes calling the shots to the legislative delegation?
Well, I think the county political leaders had a great deal of influence on the members of the legislature and how they would vote, and so a governor would have to have a lot of contact with the county political leaders in order to help get their support for legislation and the governor's legislative program.
Do you recall any sort of specific conflicts where a legislator and a county boss sort of knocked heads and how it came out?
Not off the top of my head, I don't, Don, but one of the tactics that was used many times when you had close votes on something the governor really wanted was that a political county leader and his delegation, say he might have 3 senators from that county, would hold back their votes until the very last minute and bargain for other things that they were interested in. It might be a judgeship, it might be a program for that particular county, that kind of thing. And so that was a frequent tactic that happened, and that's something the governor had to deal with on a regular basis with the legislators.
Was there ever sort of horse trading like that between the legislative delegation and their county boss back home, saying they wanted a commitment, for example, renomination in the next election, or some sort of promise from the county boss, back and forth?
Well, I think that was a process that was ongoing, and certainly that occurred because the legislators were really reliant on the county leader in many ways, but the county leader at the same time, in order to have support from year to year for his position, had to have the legislators who were very important office holders in that county.
Mm-hmm. again, keeping, I guess, our perspective now to the Cahill Hughes eras, who were sort of the colorful county bosses in both parties at that time?
Well, I guess you can't start a discussion like this without first naming Hudson County. That was the premier Democratic county in the state, and a person named John V. Kenney was the so-called boss of Hudson County, the Democratic leader of Hudson County in those days, and he exerted his influence in many ways. Among others, David Willens, who had been Attorney General of the state many years before, was the Democratic leader of Middlesex County and was an important player there. On the Republican side, there were a number of behind-the-scenes leaders, but one of the longtime leaders politically was a senator from Atlantic City, Senator Hap Farley, who was the dean of the legislature and had been there for longer than anybody else, and he exerted a great deal of influence. And a person who, behind the scenes, people didn't know about, but was very influential, was a man named Luke Gray, who was the Somerset County Republican chairman, Somerset being one of the premier Republican counties.
I think looking back over time, it's a little difficult to understand how these county bosses actually achieved their power and exercised it. Do you sort of have any sort of perspective, or was it so special to the counties and to the particular individuals involved that there's nothing general to say?
Well, one general thing you can say about it is that in those days, the political parties at the county level raised most of the money for the election campaigns. They raised the money for the candidates. And so they exerted a great deal of power because of that, because they held the purse strings for the election funds that the assemblymen and senators used. So that applied pretty much throughout the state.
Okay. Why don't we now sort of get a little biographical sketch so that we can sort of get some more perspective as to how you got into state government and politics in New Jersey?
Well, I first came down to the state capitol in Trenton in 1963 as a research associate in the Office of Legislative Information and Research, which was a nonpartisan office that served all members of the legislature. Incidentally, that office was headed by a man named Sam Alito, whose son was just recently appointed and confirmed to the United States Supreme Court. So I started out that way, and I got to know all the members of the legislature because our office did research for them. And then...
How did you get the job?
I applied for the job and was selected from among other candidates by Mr. Alito, and it was strictly nonpartisan. The office operated in a very nonpartisan way, and while I had a general Republican orientation in my background, I had never been actively involved in politics. Mm-hmm. After I served in that office for 3 years, I decided I wanted to get actively involved in politics, and so I applied for and got a job as research director of the Republican State Committee, which at that time was headed by a man named Webster Todd, who was the father of subsequent Governor Christie Whitman. Mm-hmm. And so that was where I got into the political side and the partisan side. And I worked in that office for 4 years and worked on election campaigns, and we had very much success in those days with the elections. And that was an interesting experience that I took next from.
Mm-hmm. Before we sort of proceed further, let's skip back a little bit towards your early upbringing and sort of education. I mean, how did you sort of recall sort of the early days of politics, and how did it sort of stimulate your interest to get involved in government as you grew older?
Well, I grew up in Bergen County, New Jersey. My family was not politically active, but I did major in political science in my undergraduate days in college.
Any reason for majoring in political science?
Well, I almost majored in philosophy, but I majored in political science because I was interested in public service, and the more I got into it, the more I found I had that interest. But when I graduated from college, I went to law school for a year, and then decided I didn't want to be a lawyer. Went next to join the Chase Manhattan Bank, decided after a year and a half I didn't want to become a banker, and decided I'd better go back to my original interest in public service, which I did by having a fellowship at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. And I obtained my master's degree there, and then from there applied for positions in public service, starting with the legislature.
Mm-hmm. Why did you sort of go for a Trenton job as opposed to Washington or somewhere else? Was it just sort of easier in terms of living in New Jersey and commuting? Or?
Well, that was probably one factor, but I think the state legislature offered at that time, and I think it still does very much, a challenge, because the problems of our society are reflected in many ways at the state government level in a challenging way to deal with, and it's not as overwhelming as it might be in Washington, where you have a huge administrative operation, and you can still be challenged by the complexity and difficulty of the problems, but still get your arms around them a lot better at the state government level. And that was true throughout my career. I had a number of opportunities to go to Washington subsequently, but I decided to stay in New Jersey because of those reasons.
Going back to your job under Sam Alito, sort of describe the sort of function of the office at that point in terms of support for the legislature, and also I'd be interested particularly in your personal impressions of Sam Alito as a boss and as an individual.
Well, the office was comprised of 3 researchers, Mr. Alito, another person, myself, and some support staff. And then there was an adjacent office that also had legal counsel and some fiscal services that were provided. But the entire staff at that time of the legislature, this nonpartisan staff, was probably about 12 people, which was very small. We provided research. We did research for the various pieces of legislation, actually wrote the legislation in some cases, and worked with all members of the legislature, regardless of their party. Mr. Alito was a consummate researcher. He had excellent talents as a researcher. He produced quality work. The office, I think, generally was highly regarded as producing good quality, nonpartisan work. It was operated strictly on a nonpartisan basis, and that was the way the office operated, and that was what we did.
Mm-hmm. And how did he deal with individual legislators? Did they have so much trust with him that they would allow him basically to write the bills for them for introduction?
Well, there were several attorneys who worked for the legislature at that time who did most of the bill writing, but Mr. Alito and the rest of us in the office also did some bill writing. He was highly regarded as someone who would give them the facts, give them nonpartisan information and not color it, and then it was their job to take that and to make their arguments in the legislature as to the merits or not of the legislation, and to try to get it passed.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever have contact with his son, Sam Alito Jr.?
Only several times when he was a high school student and a student at Princeton University, where he would come into the office to visit with his father and say hello to the rest of us in the office, and he might be doing some research and using some of the materials that we might have in the office, or discuss some of this with his father. So I didn't get to know him well, but I did have a few contacts with him in those days.
So you didn't get a feel for his sort of judicial philosophy in the future that might come to pass?
No, I didn't at that time.
Okay. What about his father? You couldn't sort of see an ideological bent to the research or toward his sort of personal views on politics?
He was a man of, Mr. Alito Sr. was a man of, who was conservative in his manner, but never really expressed his opinions about politics as a liberal or conservative or as a Republican or as a Democrat. So he kept his personal feelings to himself very much.
Okay. Well, let's sort of move now a little bit further. Let's sort of start with the Cahill administration. Governor Cahill ran into some political trouble during his single term in office. Could you sort of describe your sort of perspective on the politics at that point in the Republican Party in particular?
Well, Governor, as I mentioned earlier, the Secretary of State was the chief political operative for the governor in those days. It was for Governor Cahill. It had been for Governor Hughes. And the Secretary of State got into some political difficulties, and the state treasurer also, both of whom were very close associates of Governor Cahill, got into some difficulties, and this was regarded as scandalous, and it was a real problem for them politically. At the same time, Governor Cahill was pushing an ambitious program, and he had started an evaluation of the tax policy of the state and appointed a 33-member tax policy committee which had reported and recommended a state income tax, among other things. So the governor supported that and supported that income tax, and they were not successful in being able to get it through the legislature. He then came up for re-election 4 years after he was elected, and the scandals and the income tax together resulted in him not being successful in being re-elected.
I'd sort of like your views on the sort of internal dynamics within the Republican sort of caucus at that time in terms of trying to get the votes for supporting the governor's position on the income tax, and what were the dynamics and the personalities involved at that time?
Well, the commission that the governor had appointed, which studied the tax policy for 2 years, was headed by a person who was the Senate, one of the principal senators, who was head of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate at that time, and a man named Harry Sears. And it was strongly supported, and also as to the income tax by a man named Dick DeCourt, who was the majority leader in the Assembly. DeCourt headed one of the principal subcommittees of the committee. So they were the two principal players within the legislature, and they pushed very hard for this and worked on it. But there was a feeling that among the majority of legislators, really in both parties, I think at that point, that the state wasn't quite ready for an income tax. It was the first broad-based tax that would subsequently be enacted. And so the governor tried very hard, exerted his political influence, but was not successful in getting it through.
When you say tried very hard, do you remember sort of the mechanics of the sort of jockeying between the governor's office and the legislature at that time, and were there, again, sort of quid pro quos that were being discussed in terms of trading votes for support?
Well, the legislative leaders at that time were people who were very supportive of Governor Cahill generally, and they supported his programs, and so he worked well with them. But legislators, other Republican legislators, particularly from the rural areas and the suburban areas, were less enamored of the program and the income tax and the changes. And some of the changes, some of the other changes that were being recommended as part of this program would have benefited some of the urban areas, and so some of the urban legislators were more inclined to support this program than the suburban and rural legislators. But the legislature at that time was still very much dominated by those suburban and rural interests.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any personal role in sort of the political strategy at that time, or were you sort of on the sidelines in terms of the political discussion?
I was not very much involved directly in the politics of it. Although I had been research director for Governor Cahill's campaign initially, I was involved in a little bit of the policy discussions. But I was more involved in the mechanics of getting the legislation together and trying to get it through the legislature.
Okay. And as we get toward the next election, when Governor Cahill is running for re-election, I guess what was your perspective in terms of how he stood politically and what the prospects were for the party in the 73 election?
I think that that other people who were around the governor and myself felt that the prospects were not particularly promising. We recognized the negative political impact of the unsuccessful income tax effort. We recognized those negative impacts, particularly from the scandals with the Secretary of State and the Treasurer, and as a result, I think there was not a great deal of optimism among a lot of us about the prospects of him being elected.
At this point, how significant, if any, were sort of polls, either public polls like the Eagleton poll or internal private polls that might have been commissioned by the party?
I really don't know about that, Don. I don't recall seeing the particular polls early on to know what his standing was, but I think generally that any polls that came out publicly at that time did reflect that his popularity had diminished.
But in your view, was it essentially sort of the political professional sort of judgment that he was in trouble, or was it something more objective that could be measured?
Well, I think there was common sense tells you that when you have some difficulties like the scandals that he had, and you pushed a program that was not popular like an income tax, that he was going to have difficulty. But in addition, the political professionals were of that judgment as well. But the governor is very powerful. The governor wanted to run for re-election, and he made an attempt to do it, but was unsuccessful.
Now, were you surprised when he lost in the primary? Now, given the fact that he was in trouble, was that more an assessment that he'd have trouble in the general election as opposed to primary? I mean, it's unusual in New Jersey history for an incumbent governor not to be renominated for re-election.
We thought it would primarily present difficulties in the general election, but we recognized it would also present problems in the primary. And one of the interesting things I recall at that time was, and Ray Bateman, who was my good friend, was the campaign manager for Governor Cahill in the primary. Governor Cahill would go out and he would be told by his advisors, don't talk about the scandals, talk about all the positive achievements that you've made in education and transportation and other programs. And he would get in and start to talk about that, and then quickly he would shift over into a defensive mode and talked about the problems of the scandals. Mm-hmm. And that was counterproductive in terms of the political effort, and did not help him to be an effective campaigner.
So he wasn't easily sort of shaped by the political consultants and the other advisors who were trying to give him a different path in the campaign?
No, he was not, and he was very much his own man in many respects, in that respect too.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess Congressman Sandman was his principal, if not only, opponent in the primary, or was that not true?
I believe that, I think he was the principal opponent, yes. And he had run in the primary years before, 4 years before, when Governor Cahill was elected he actually beat Congressman Sandman and several state senators in a primary election. So Sandman was not a newcomer to that process.
Do you recall any discussion about trying to sort of get other candidates into the primary, so to split the anti-Cahill vote?
No, I don't really recall that being any particular focus.
Although in retrospect it might have been a sort of productive strategy, I guess, given sort of subsequent to primaries like the Byrne primary.
Possibly, sure.
Okay. What was your sort of personal reaction after the primary results?
Well, it was disappointment because I think Governor Cahill, despite the scandal, served very well and was an effective governor in many respects on a lot of state programs. So I was disappointed, and I personally was much less conservative than Congressman Sandman at the time, and although he was quite a congenial person, I was disappointed that Governor Cahill was not successful.
From a career perspective, did you sort of then think about maybe leaving Trenton and looking for something else to do?
I thought about it, and I did talk to people in Washington about possibility of some positions there and had some opportunities to do that, but I decided I still wanted to stay in New Jersey.
Okay. But I guess that sort of gives you some feeling of insecurity at that point, not knowing who is going to be elected and whether they're going to want you in a particular position or who are the players going to be.
Well, at that time, I was so-called executive director of the state Senate. I was the chief staff person for the Republican senators, so my position was fine. It was not subject to being changed because the governor changed.
But it might change if the party control changed at that time.
Correct.
In the election.
Yes.
So in those days, would there be a significant reduction in if the majority suddenly became the minority in the next election in terms of staff support?
There wasn't. There was some reduction, but it wasn't significant, I think.
Okay. Now, in terms of looking at the Democratic field in the 73 primary, what was your sort of take on what the prospects were for the various candidates?
Well, I'm trying to remember all of the various candidates that were there, and I think it was not clear to most people who would emerge from that primary and be successful. And as I recall, Governor Byrne, Brendan Byrne was, I guess, a judge at that time, was successful, but with not a majority of the vote in the primary.
Mm-hmm. What was your first sort of personal contact with Governor Byrne?
Well, I did not know him personally until he was elected. And then when he was elected, I dealt with him with meetings of the legislative leadership, which I attended, and got to know him that way, primarily in reference to legislation.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back before the election to the Sandman-Byrne election, speaking sort of from the perspective of a Republican, did you feel that the Sandman campaign was doomed from the start, or did you think there might be some prospect for success?
Well, I thought that the Sandman campaign would have a great deal of difficulty because I felt it was more conservative than the general electorate of the state for a general election. Although Governor Byrne was not well known, so there was some uncertainty as to how strong the Democratic candidate was going to be.
Was there discussion within the party as to how effective a candidate Governor Byrne was in the general election campaign?
Well, I think that there was some feeling that he might not be that strong a candidate because he wasn't as well known and may not have had the political skills that were evident later on. So I think there was some feeling of that. He did come out as someone who was not beholden to a lot of the so-called bosses of the county political organizations, and that was a positive thing for him.
Mm. And as you, I think, implied, that election also was colored by the sort of scandals that had affected the Cahill administration, and I guess was a major reason for Governor Byrne sort of declaring as a candidate and resigning from the bench.
Yes, there was an atmosphere of concern about scandal, and so that benefited Governor Byrne, who had not been involved in any of that, and came across as someone who was not tainted by any of that, and had been a prosecutor and a judge, and the voters looked favorably at that aspect of it.
In terms of campaign strategy at that time, this is sort of in the earlier days of television and broadcast sort of campaigning. Sort of where were the sort of significant points to sort of influence New Jersey elections? I guess at that time newspapers probably were more important than they are today.
Newspapers were probably the principal medium for influencing voter opinion. Television was less significant, and particularly television in New York, which was the largest media market, was very expensive to obtain, and the television stations in New York particularly did not cover New Jersey government and politics very much at all. It was a subsequent effort to try to change that, which had some effect, but that was a major problem. The largest newspaper at that time was the Newark Evening News, which is now ceased publication many years ago, but the newspapers were pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm. In terms of sort of influence the editorial establishment in the newspapers, at that time, were most of them sort of leaning Republican, leaning Democrat, or was it sort of pretty much 50-50?
I think for the most part, the major newspapers in the state were more Republican-leaning than Democrat, and they generally, in their editorial policies, were a little more conservative and were generally likely to support Republican statewide candidates.
Mm-hmm. Did you think the editorials really did have a significant influence in changing voter opinions?
I think they had some, but it's always been a question in my mind over the years as to just how much impact newspaper editorials really have, how many people that really read that. I think there's a certain group of people in the state who are more inclined to read those editorials, who obviously are going to be affected by them, but the general population probably doesn't even read the editorials.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that the Cahill administration had a tax policy commission that recommended an income tax. What's your recollection of sort of the positions of the respective Byrne and Sandman campaigns on the tax issue?
Well, my recollection is that Congressman Sandman did not support an income tax, never had supported that. And I'm not really sure what subsequent Governor Byrne said about it in the campaign. I think he might have, he certainly had more of an open mind about it than Sandman did.
I think the quote was, he didn't see the need in the foreseeable future.
Right. That is what he said. Right.
Now, within the party, I assume some of the more moderate Republicans were a little reluctant to support the Sandman campaign, or did they sort of get on board somewhat, maybe without enthusiasm?
I think the latter. I think they publicly supported the candidacy of Sandman, but without any real enthusiasm.
Hmm. And how about Governor Cahill's position? Did he go out and campaign for Sandman, or was there still such bad blood between the two men personally that he was reluctant to do that? Did you get any signals of his position in terms of the general election?
My recollection is that Governor Cahill did not enthusiastically support Sandman. He probably spent more time on the golf course that summer and fall.
Okay. Did you get a feel that he really would prefer Governor Byrne's election over Congressman Sandman?
I didn't really get that feel because necessarily because I don't know that he knew Brendan Byrne at that time. But he was certainly not enamored of Congressman Sandman.
Okay. All right. Now I guess we're after the election. The Byrne team is sort of in transition mode, appointing people to the government. I guess in terms of your position with the state Senate, how did you sort of look at what they were doing, and what strategy did you have in sort of dealing with the new administration? Was it just basically reacting to what they were going to propose, or were you going to develop an independent Republican agenda?
It was always hard for the legislative majority to develop an agenda of its own. Although that happened on occasion, it was difficult to do because of the disparate members of the Assembly and Senate and their various positions. So that was hard. It was mostly reactive. I think there was not a lot of knowledge of Brendan Byrne because he is not somebody who came out of the legislature, who had served with these people who were in the legislature then. And so he was kind of an unknown factor, really.
In terms of the leadership at that point, institutionally, do you think the Senate President and the Assembly Speaker then had less or more clout in terms of exerting party discipline within their own caucuses than they do today?
Well, I think they, in many ways, they had stronger ability if they were able to work with the county leadership to discipline members and have party discipline. In today's world, with the legislative districts not being coterminous with the counties and not having a strong political leaders, it's more difficult, I think, to have that discipline.
Lou, as the Byrne administration sort of takes office and he gives sort of his first sort of address to the legislature, what signals were you getting then as to what the program was? Did you see it as sort of a very liberal, progressive program? Was it somewhat middle of the road? Just what signs did you get as to what this administration wanted to accomplish?
Well, the income tax and any tax increases that might be suggested was always on people's mind. And at that point, the majority of the Republican legislators were not in favor of that, certainly. There was a stylistic factor that came in early on, too. Some of the staff people that the governor had brought in were viewed by legislators as not being particularly congenial or receptive to their thoughts and ideas, and they expressed some concern about whether they could work effectively with these people.
You want to name names?
Well, at that time, the principal people who the governor brought in were Dick Leone as treasurer and Luke Hayden as the chief counsel of the governor. Both very competent people who I think performed very well over time, but at the beginning they were viewed as not reaching out as much to, certainly to the Republican legislators as some others might.
So I guess in contrast to some of the old sort of gregarious relationships in the Cahill and Hughes administrations, the Byrne administration tended to be a little bit more aloof or cold in terms of its legislative relation?
That was a perception that a lot of the Republican legislators had at the time. Yeah.
And I guess maybe some of this might have been the youth of both Dick Leone and Luke Hayden?
Yeah, certainly that might have been a factor. Both very competent people who performed well in many respects, but were not viewed as as easy to deal with, or perhaps as easier to deal with as some of the other people, legislators had been dealing with in the past.
In terms of the sort of Republican leadership, again, we've sort of talked a little bit about who the personalities were, but sort of give us an outline of who the key players were at the time of the sort of first year of the Byrne administration.
Well, in the state Senate, there were a number of people who rose into the leadership. Senator Ray Bateman, Senator Al Beedleston, and Senator Harry Sears were three of the principal leaders. Beedleston was more conservative from Monmouth County. They were all long-time experienced legislators in the Assembly. There were other people who rose to leadership, including subsequently Governor Tom Kean and Assemblyman Dick DeCourt, and they were some of the principal people who were involved.
Now, in those days, just how did leaders sort of emerge? Was it sort of a question of their peers recognizing their competence? Was it a question of or was it a factor of the significance of the counties that they were representing? Just how did they sort of emerge into the leadership?
Well, generally it was a tradition, and it was a strong tradition at the time in both houses, of rotating leadership. And if it was your particular areas, your county's turn, the leader from the delegation from that county would become the Senate President or Majority Leader or the Assembly Speaker, that kind of thing. And in the Senate particularly, they rotated the leaders every year, so that there was a new Senate President every year. And around that time, they started something which has changed the leadership continuity significantly over the last 20 years, and that is that they started to go to multiple-year leadership. But in those days, it was every year the legislative leadership would change, and so that I guess was a factor that made that leadership somewhat weaker than it would have been if they had more continuity.
Well, I guess it must be inevitable that when you have rotating leadership, some people are viewed as not as strong as others would be, and you have people in the titles of leaders, right, where most of the caucus might feel that they really weren't effective leaders. How did that sort of play itself out? Were there sort of leaders who didn't have the titles within the caucus, people who were respected but didn't have the sort of formal positions of leadership?
Well, in the Republican leadership at that time, most of the highly respected, experienced leadership were able to rise into the formal leadership positions. There were other people behind the scenes. I mentioned Senator Hap Farley before from Atlantic City. He was still at the twilight of his career, but still exerted a lot of influence, and there were other people like that behind the scenes that exerted influence as well.
To what extent did you feel within the caucus that leadership positions were also viewed as a stepping stone to run for governor or maybe for U.S. Senator or Congress? Well,
so many of the assemblymen, and particularly senators who got elected, viewed themselves as future governors. They wanted to get on the ladder of leadership to move up and get more visibility, and it was viewed at that time as a good stepping stone to try to become the nominee of their party for governor.
Mm-hmm. And did that lead to some pressure, given that it was a rotating leadership, to sort of strike when you were in the leadership, given the fact that you would lose the position given time?
Well, I think that it sort of worked itself out. People got in line and they moved their way up the ladder. In the Senate, for instance, you'd become chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and then you would become the assistant majority leader and the majority leader and then the Senate president. So it was a 4 or 5 year progression, and And that's people understood that and worked that system to their advantage.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the legislative staff and organization at that point. It's, as you said, I guess grown over time, and in the Byrne administration became larger than during your earlier years in Trenton. Did you think at that point that it was sort of an efficient operation, that the sort of staff was at a level that it should be, and that the sort of professional help that the legislature was requesting was provided?
I think at that stage in history, the legislature needed more help. They needed more professional assistance. They needed a committee system that functioned effectively, which they had not had previously, and that's an important point to keep in mind. The legislative bodies, both the Senate and Assembly, had a committee system on paper, but it really didn't function very well in the way we think of it today. There were no meeting rooms. There was no staff for the committees. A bill would be assigned to a committee, and the committee chairman would talk to his fellow committee people. He might have a meeting, he might not, and then he would sign the bill out of committee, get the other members to sign it out, and it went from there on, onto the Senate or Assembly floor. So the committee system was on paper, but it really didn't function that well. Mm-hmm. It limited public input significantly in that respect, and so.
Lou, in terms of the New Jersey legislature, there are some things that sort of make us different. In some ways, I guess we're similar to other states, but we're a commuter legislature. We also have sort of a split session in the sense that the legislature meets typically 1 or 2 days a week during its session time and adjourns for the summer and election periods usually. But what are your thoughts about how the sort of differences in New Jersey affect the way state policy is made in the legislature?
Well, you're right. The principal differences between New Jersey's legislature and other legislators involve the fact that it's commuter, and the sessions are continuous throughout the year, 1 or 2 days a week, instead of having a concentrated 60 or 90-day kind of session that others do. I think in many ways it's helpful to have that continuing presence of the legislature there in the Capitol, interacting with the governor, rather than having it just at a concentrated period. So I've always kind of liked that aspect of New Jersey's legislature. It is different, but I think it's been a fairly effective way to operate.
But isn't there advantage when you have a more concentrated session and people are sort of staying in local hotels and going to go out to dinner and talk about issues that are coming up and negotiate compromises? Doesn't that have a significant advantage over the New Jersey system?
It has some advantages, but at the same time, because we are a small state with a good transportation network, legislators can get to Trenton in no more than 2 hours, and they do have a lot of interaction. I think that the one difference, though, from the way the legislature operated in the past was it used to be more social. That legislators would go out after the legislative sessions for dinner and have an opportunity to talk more, and they do that less now than they used to.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that in a commuter legislature, the legislators tend to be more influenced by their local constituencies than they would be if they were in a concentrated session in the state capitol?
I don't know that it would really make that much difference, Don. I think that the local officials always are going to have a significant impact on their legislators, and the legislators, being sensitive to voters' concerns, are going to have to deal with those local problems. So I don't think that factor is that materially different.
What about that, just sort of the practical reality of when you have a major issue, say like a tax bill, and the session drags on into the evening or early hours of the next morning, does that lead to sort of pressure to just get the thing done so that they can go home?
Well, legislators always, and it's not any different in other states, I think, than it is in New Jersey, tend to procrastinate and wait till the last minute to deal with a lot of major legislation and other problems. I think when they do that, they then start to concentrate heavily, and it results in long sessions that might end in the early hours of the morning, that kind of thing. But they seem to get it done one way or another. The fact that there's still a committee system now that functions pretty well, they can spend those hours with the committee sessions to try to concentrate on knowing more about the legislation.
Now, going back again to sort of the Byrne transition period, before we sort of deal, I guess, with the tax issue, which tended to dominate the first year, one of the issues that actually I think came up during the transition was the Meadowlands and the potential construction of the football stadium for the Giants. Was there any discussion within the caucus as to what the legislative position would be in terms of the financing of the Meadowlands?
I think that was left largely to the executive branch, the governor and the treasurer to be dealing with. Some of the legislative leaders under Governor Cahill had worked very closely with him to bring to fruition the Meadowlands Sports Complex proposal. But the details of financing it and how it was going to be paid for really were left more to the executive branch.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you point out, the Meadowlands initially was a major Cahill sort of initiative.
Right.
Do you recall any sort of lobbying from Governor Cahill, even after he had lost the primary election, to try to sort of save the Meadowlands proposals for the financing of the stadium as a legacy for his own administration, and also maybe to, frankly, help out incoming Governor Byrne?
Well, I think Governor Cahill was certainly aware of the legacy of the Meadowlands. His state treasurer, Joe McCrane, had been the principal supporter and initiator of the project. They were very interested in seeing it succeed, and I think they, behind the scenes, worked with people coming in the new administration, new Byrne administration at that time, to see the project get built and financed.
But you don't recall any sort of briefings from the Byrne transition office in terms of what they intended to do and what their negotiations were like with the bankers and the others who were involved?
Yeah, I wasn't involved in any discussions like that, so I'm not really privy to them.
And I guess there was also some meddling from New York about trying to sort of sink the project at that time.
I think it became evident over time, and not so evident publicly at the time, that Governor Rockefeller in New York was not anxious to see the project succeed and was working with people on Wall Street to try to not have it be financed. And so I think Governor Cahill and his advisors were well aware of those concerns.
Okay. Another sort of major impact, obviously, in the early years of Governor Byrne's first term was the sort of influence of the state Supreme Court's decision in the Robinson-Cahill and school finance sort of litigation. From the legislature's standpoint, how did you sort of view the court's activism at that point and the decision in itself? Was there some feeling of resistance that this was, again, judicial meddling in the sort of turf of the executive and the legislature?
I think there was a substantial feeling that the courts may have overstepped their bounds at that time in that decision. And so there was a significant amount of resistance on the part of many legislators to that decision.
Now, was there any discussion of challenging the court's decision formally in terms of constitutional amendments, There was obviously a lot of criticism, but was there any significant effort to say, well, the court has gone too far, we have to sort of cut it back in terms of its power and jurisdiction?
I don't recall any formal substantial effort to do that, to cut back and to really formally limit the court's powers. But there was certainly a lot of concern about the decision.
Now, at that time, I think the New Jersey Supreme Court had a very prominent reputation nationally in terms of the influence of its decisions, sort of the intellectual caliber of the court, particularly the Chief Justice and others, and the history of the court, particularly since the 1947 Constitution. To what extent did sort of this respect and reputation of the court maybe cause the legislature to be a little bit more cautious in terms of challenging its decisions on the school finance cases?
I think that was probably a factor, an unstated factor. You're correct that the court was held in high regard around the country and within the state and within the legislature as well. So that sustained the respect of the court, and I think probably deterred some people from who were not happy with the Robinson decision to take further action.
Okay. Was there any sort of effort again to sort of develop a disciplined Republican position on the court decision?
I don't recall that there was a great deal of effort to pull it together. It was always hard when you were the party who did not have the governorship to formulate a legislative program like that.
Okay. And also, with Governor Byrne's election, you also sort of lost a lot of legislators. How did that impact, I guess, the sort of position of the Republicans at that time?
Well, it probably had the effect of making them be more the opposition party, not always the loyal opposition party, but to strengthen the reaction and the instinct to oppose the new governor's programs.
Could you sort of embellish a little bit on that? I mean, in terms of the sort of size of the minority. I mean, do you think that when you're a very small minority, it has a difference than when you're pretty close to 50-50?
I recall, not at that time, but at a time previous to that, when the Republicans had gone from a majority in the Assembly to only 17 members, that the then new Republican minority leader said to the caucus in a private meeting, which I happened to attend, last year we could be partly irresponsible, now we can be totally irresponsible.
So it gives you that freedom when you're really not influencing too much in terms of the actual outcome of the vote to sort of throw some bombs, I guess?
Yes, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay. Now let's, I guess, move to the Byrne administration's reaction to the court decisions and to its own sort of tax initiatives. What do you sort of recall about the sort of early reaction of the Republicans to this sort of new tax program coming forward from the Byrne administration?
Well, there were some people who had supported the Cahill initiative for the income tax, and so there were some supporters there. But again, not having the responsibility of leadership, they were more behind the scenes, didn't get out front on that, and there was a lot of strong opposition from other legislators throughout the state.
Mm-hmm. Now, to some extent, as you said, the personalities of the governor's staff dealing with the legislature had some impact. Now you have sort of a substantive policy position coming from the administration. Did that tend to sort of further sort of divide the partisan sort of barriers in terms of the relationship between executives in the legislature? Were things becoming a little more bitter or a little more testy in terms of the significance of this issue?
Well, I think the style issue, if I can call it that, was still a factor, and that made it difficult. Legislators, by nature, like to be told how important that they are and respected, and in some cases they didn't feel they were getting the respect that they might, or their ideas weren't getting the respect they might. So personalities always are a factor that way, and to that extent there was a factor for a while.
Well, you mentioned the significant positions of Treasurer Dick Leone and Counsel Lou Caden. How about the sort of relationship of the minority leadership and maybe individual Republican legislators when they dealt with Governor Byrne personally?
Well, I think that Governor Byrne began to show the political skills that he has that are considerable, and worked individually with legislators and legislative leaders in the minority effectively, and so I think that was not a negative factor at that point.
But was there a feeling that it was more difficult to get access to the governor personally, that you had to sort of deal more frequently through staff than in prior administrations?
I think there was some legislators had that feeling. I'm not sure it was really pervasive.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't feel that the staff was trying to intervene to block access to the governor and sort of prevent you from getting sort of personal commitments?
There's always that feeling on the part of some legislators with any governor, I think, but I think it might have been a little bit more at that time than other times, but not overly so.
In terms of the tax position within the Republican caucus, Governor Cahill had proposed a tax. There were some Republicans who supported that. Were there difficulties in trying to keep the more moderate pro-tax Republicans from supporting the Byrne proposals?
I think there was some interest in trying to have a party position against the income tax, but people like Assemblyman Dick DeCourt from Bergen County, who had been a key participant in the Cahill program, were still strongly in favor of but he was in a very small minority.
Mm-hmm. And I guess in those days, how did you sort of try to prevent a Dick DeCourt from sort of jumping ship to go with the administration? Was there, or was he so respected that wasn't really done, that you just respected his position and let him sort of make his own decisions? Or was there, really pressure from the leadership to say, Dick, we really need a cohesive party position on this?
I think there was some pressure to do it, but I'm not sure there was any feeling among all of the legislators that the bill was going to be able to come up for a vote, mm-hmm. So that they weren't sure they were actually going to have to face a vote in a public situation.
And that was on the assumption that the Democrats wouldn't be able to get their own act together and
Correct.
Get enough votes to sort of get the bill posted.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Now the Byrne administration sort of flounders a little bit on the tax position. Again, sort of looking back, what did the sort of Republicans see as options? There were other discussions, I guess, about a statewide property tax, about a sales tax increase, about cutting back the state government, and all sorts of other sort of options. Was there any sort of attempt to try to pursue any of those alternatives to the income tax?
There were some individual attempts by individual legislators or groups of legislators to explore the possibility of raising the sales tax, of certainly cutting back on what they viewed as waste and fat in government. there were talks about a tax convention. That there was some legislation that said, we'll call a convention and we'll have the voters decide this, and we'll take a look at the whole system.
Just like we're talking about now.
Well, there were some similarities to it, sure. Yeah.
In terms of this failure of the Byrne administration to sort of produce the Democratic votes for a tax, did this sort of generate feeling among the Republicans that this was sort of the beginning of an unsuccessful administration, that we should just sort of sit back and see what happens and wait for the next election?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was a prevalent feeling at the time.
And in terms of getting closer to the next legislative election, what was the strategy within the Republicans? Was this the idea that you'd recruit really strong candidates because you thought, again, there would be a backlash against the Byrne program? I
think there was a feeling that of some confidence that the Byrne administration was not off to a strong start politically, and that meant that the Republicans had a good chance in the next election.
Okay. Now we have further Supreme Court decisions after the legislature doesn't sort of respond to their earlier decisions. And there's an order to sort of close the schools, I guess, in July '76. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about sort of the atmosphere at that time when the court has sort of given this deadline to the executive and the legislature to do something, and what the sort of options were being discussed within the Republican caucus.
Well, I think there was still some resentment of the court's decision and what legislators viewed as intrusion by the court. And so there was reluctance initially to step up and deal with it. But the options were pretty limited, and I think that they looked to the governor as the only statewide elected official to have the principal responsibility to deal with it. And they felt, the Republican legislators felt they could sit back still, although they were starting to feel the pressure of having to do something.
Mm-hmm. Were there any individual legislators within the caucus who were saying, look, we really can't just sit on our hands, that this is an issue that's going to affect our districts if the schools are closed, if they remain closed, and we can't simply, let the Democrats sort of stew in their own problem?
I think certainly legislators like Dick DeCourt and Senator Harry Sears, who had been so instrumental in the CALE program, were saying those kinds of things, and there were others as well. But it was still the view that the principal responsibility was there with the governor.
Mm-hmm. What was Senator Bateman's position, if you recall?
I really don't recall individually what his position was at that point. I'm sure, being one of the more responsible legislators at that time, I'm sure he was very concerned about the legislature fulfilling its responsibilities. And
he was also a leader in terms of school finance and school reform in New Jersey.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Now, given the court's sort of leverage in terms of forcing some action, finally the legislature does act. Can you sort of recall those long, prolonged sessions in the summer?
I'd rather forget.
Well, what was it like?
I think it was very demanding on everybody's part. They were not happy at the task that they had that was before them. But they had a responsibility, and they were reluctantly going at it. It was not easy, and there was a lot of skill necessary in counting votes properly.
Mm-hmm. In terms of just the environment of the chambers at that time. You're in the middle of the summer. Normally the legislature tries to adjourn before it gets too hot. This is before air conditioning in the State House. Did that have any impact at how uncomfortable it was in terms of just the environment of trying to make these decisions?
Well, that certainly didn't help. Neither of the chambers was air conditioned. They used to throw open all the windows, and the Assembly chamber had more windows than the Senate did, so they could be a little cooler. But it was not a time that the legislators were happy with. Just having to spend as much time in Trenton as they did, and under those conditions, was very trying.
Mm-hmm. And Lou, you moved over in '74 to the Election Law Enforcement Commission as its executive director. Sort of give us a little bit of background of the creation of the commission and exactly what your role was at that point.
Well, the commission had been created a few years before that. And this was a time when the Watergate scandal in Washington was on everybody's mind. There was a feeling that we needed some changes in election campaign finance activity and reform, and so the commission was formed. It was a 4-member commission with a staff. I was the second director of it. The first director left after about a year and a half. And so I took over in this time of Watergate, and we subsequently had the first publicly financed gubernatorial election in 1977 in New Jersey for governor. This was the first one for governor in the country, and so there was a lot of focus on that. It was an interesting time, but a time of transition.
Mm-hmm. Now, Governor Byrne, I guess, proposed some of the early public financing bills. In terms of changing the sort of politics of New Jersey, has it had a lasting impact, or was it really short term? Money obviously has become, again, a sort of significant issue in state politics.
Well, I think it had a significant impact in terms of the way candidates went about raising money for a number of years. In recent years, of course, we've seen candidates, a number of candidates who have personal financial wealth and were willing to spend it to opt out of the system and finance their campaigns themselves. And that's been a significant change. And it would be interesting now to go back and do a reevaluation of that law and its impact over all these years, over the last 30 years. I think it did have some significant beneficial impacts for a while. It's a question today of whether it really has had any significant effect when you have candidates who are stepping up and financing the system out of their own money and with the disparate amounts that the candidates spend.
Another area that the Election Law Enforcement Commission oversees is sort of lobbying and spending by lobbyists. And there has been significant expansion of disclosure requirements in terms of the gifts and other spending by the lobbying community. What are your sort of perspectives on how the role of lobbyists has changed over the years that you've been involved in state politics?
Well, I think there's been a definite change from what it was back in the 1960s. The lobbyists, the people that the legislators dealt with on a regular basis, were usually staff members of corporations or associations, that kind of thing, labor union officials themselves. And it was in the 60s when we first had the advent of what we call contract lobbyists, which would be individuals who perhaps had significant government experience themselves or otherwise, And they set themselves up and took multiple clients and represented those clients before the legislature. And they became the principal interactors with the legislators. And that's the case today. We have many contract lobbying firms that do this, and the organizations themselves, the corporations, labor unions, various other associations use these people to do their principal lobbying. I think the disclosure has been a good thing. The 1973 law for both campaign finance and lobbying provides for a lot of disclosure. That's the heart of it. That's a good thing. People can get more information, make decisions themselves as to the impact on policy.
Now, as the Byrne administration continues in its first term, your perspective is now more from a nonpartisan standpoint as director of the Election Law Enforcement Commission. But you obviously, as a citizen and active Republican in your prior career, had some perspective. How did you sort of see the prospects of the Byrne administration as the governor moved toward thinking about running for re-election? There was obviously some talk about him not seeking re-election.
Well, at that time there was a phrase, one-term Byrne, that was prevalent, and a lot of people thought that he would not run for or couldn't get elected to a second term.
What was your personal view?
My personal view was that it was probably going to be difficult for him to get elected, get reelected, but at the same time, the issues were changing, and and I thought that he was ultimately on the right side of the major fiscal issue for the state, which was how to finance the state government in the future and the income tax, and that the opinion leaders of the state clearly at that point were in favor of some broad-based tax, income tax pretty much, and that he was stepping up and was on that side of the issue, and that the Republican candidate, my personal view was that the Republican candidate had to have a credible alternative to that or support that in some way in order to sustain a good position for the general election. As it turned out, I think that was the Republican candidate, my good friend Ray Bateman, ran, and I don't think he did have that, and as a result, that was one of the factors that caused him to lose the election.
To the extent you had any sort of personal contact with sort of Republican, activists at that time, was there a significant number of people trying to urge Senator Bateman to take a more moderate position on the tax, or was it viewed politically that he couldn't sort of support any sort of tax proposal in his campaign?
I was running the Nonpartisan Election Law Enforcement Commission at that time, and I really did not have any contact with him purposely and his campaign during that period. But I think there were some people who may have been taking that position. I think the majority opinion was that he could get elected without supporting the income tax. But again, I think a credible alternative was really what was called for. And there didn't seem to be one at that point, and which was pointed out by a lot of opinion leaders, newspapers, and others at that time. Yeah. I had a sensitive situation where I was running the Election Law Enforcement Commission, making decisions about the election, which involved somebody who had been my boss before, Ray Bateman. Mm-hmm.
And I guess also, as director of the Election Law Enforcement Commission, you saw, particularly in that election year, the impact of public finance and how it had changed, I guess, the fundraising sort of dynamics of New Jersey. Talk about a little bit about that. In the primary, I guess it sort of obviously probably helped Governor Byrne because he was the incumbent. He had an organization. He had people to rely on, even though he had sort of a significant portion of his party that had sort of been disappointed or had sort of withheld their support, and he had significant opposition within that primary. But in those terms, at least in the primary election, he probably had an advantage in fundraising given the number of opponents he had. And in the general, it was also, I guess, where fundraising wasn't as significant as it had been previously or maybe in more recent elections.
Well, I think the impact of the law, if the candidates were to take, as he did, public money to fund their campaign, was it proved to be as intended, that the candidates had to spend less effort raising that money and didn't feel the pressures to take large contributions, were not able to take large contributions under the law. And so I think it had beneficial impacts on that and giving candidates more time to concentrate on the issues in the campaign.
Okay. Now, again, you're with the Election Law Enforcement Commission, sort of looking in a nonpartisan way at what's happening. The Byrne re-election campaign, although it started at a real difficult point in terms of how many primary opponents he had, and then subsequently started with a significant sort of gap between the Byrne approval and the Bateman approval as they started the general election campaign. What was sort of your perspective as how the campaign progressed and how things changed among voter opinions?
Well, I think at the beginning of the campaign, Governor Byrne's approval rating was low, and Governor Ray Bateman's approval rating was high, although he was not as well known. But that changed over time as more and more of the campaign focused on the fiscal issue. And I think as long as they were talking about other issues and transportation, education, other kinds of things where I think Bateman had a stronger position, he was viewed positively. When they got onto the fiscal issue and what was viewed as a lack of a credible alternative to solving the state's fiscal problems, it started to negatively impact the Bateman campaign.
And the Bateman proposal, which was known as the Bateman-Simon plan after former Nixon Treasury Secretary Bill Simon, was received, I guess, with some skepticism among the media and among some of the more significant establishment opinion leaders. How did you sort of see it at that time when they announced that plan? Did you feel it was going to lead to a defeat, or was it something that you felt that the campaign could sort of overcome?
I thought it was somewhat ominous at the time that it might very well lead to defeat, but I don't think many people shared that opinion.
Looking back at it, it seems somewhat strange in New Jersey, which has a reputation for voters not being particularly interested in state government or politics, that opinions could shift so radically in the course of that election. And I think there have been subsequent elections where we've seen that also. But how did, at least at that time, did you think the message got out that, for example, the Bateman-Simon plan wasn't credible? I mean, how did you sort of use, and how did Governor Byrne and the Democrats use the sort of communication vehicles that were available at that time? And again, we have sort of the problem of lack of a TV station and wide media coverage. Lou, Governor Byrne's campaign sort of took off as the public reaction set into the Bateman-Simon tax plan, and he seemed to be getting stronger in terms of the prospects for his reelection. Sort of what was your view? Did you think that the Byrne campaign really could sort of pull it off in terms of coming from so far behind?
I did. I'm not sure that that many people agreed with me, but I sort of felt the erosion from a abatement campaign standpoint of support. And of course, I was in a nonpartisan position at that point, so I was looking at it from that standpoint.
In terms of Senator Bateman's sort of campaign style, do you think he was an effective campaigner? Did that have any contribution to the problems he faced on Election Day?
I think he was an effective campaigner. He's a very congenial person who had been quite popular, or still is very popular these days. But I think that on that issue, particularly the fiscal issue, he just did not have what was viewed as a credible position again, and so I think that really cost him a great deal of support.
From your objective position as a voter, I assume you watched the debates between the candidates. Do you recall any impressions?
I don't recall any real specific impressions. I think thinking of Governor Byrne when he first got elected, and then 4 years later when he was running for re-election, I think he was a much more effective public speaker as he had developed a lot of political skills over that time.
Now, in terms of the Byrne sort of re-election, after a somewhat surprising surprising result in overcoming the deficit he faced early in the campaign, did you sort of see sort of a new energy in the administration as it approached the second term, or was that something that was sort of more evident as things developed over time in that second term?
I think there was new energy, as evidenced by a focus or refocus on certain issues, and also changes in personnel, which is good because so many of the positions in the upper levels of state government are kind of burnout positions, and it's good to have new leadership and new energy that is brought to the activity.
Mm-hmm. And you continued at the Election Law Enforcement Commission into 1979, I believe?
Yes.
And then came back into a more partisan position with the idea that you would be active in the Kane campaign for governor. Could you sort of give a little bit of background, and we'll talk about that more separately?
I felt I had completed what I wanted to do with the Election Law Enforcement Commission. We had gotten the commission off. We'd run a good first publicly financed campaign under the new law, and I felt I left that in good shape, and I wanted to move back into partisan politics with the gubernatorial election looming in 1981. So I wanted to be in a position so I could play whatever role I might in that campaign. So that was why I moved back to a position I'd had previously in the Senate, and was able to work on partisan political activity then.
Okay. Now, looking back at it over time, given the years that have passed since the end of the Byrne administration, I'd be interested in your general comments about Governor Byrne's style compared to the other governors we had spoken about previously, particularly Governor Cahill and Governor Hughes, and some of the subsequent governors since, Governor Kane and the rest of them over time. I mean, how was he similar? How was he different? How was his style somewhat unique? And sort of give us your impressions of where Governor Byrne sort of stands in that sort of panoply of governors that you've known.
Well, I think that Governor Byrne, over his term in office, demonstrated great political skill, which he had developed over years in various other public positions and with a family background in politics, and he used it very effectively. In many ways, he was much more effective, I think, behind the scenes than he was as a public speaker. Although in recent years, of course, he's well known as a public speaker, but he developed that talent over time. when Governor Kane took office in the transition period, and I headed the transition committee for Governor Kane, he and Governor Byrne and Harold Hodes, who was Governor Byrne's chief of staff, and I had a series of meetings, about 10 meetings on the transition. Governor Byrne was very helpful, despite some of the criticisms that Tom Kane had issued during the campaign of his campaign. And one of the things I found was how insightful Governor Byrne was when I got to know him better in those meetings. I think Governor Byrne's style publicly was not always as effective as some other governors like Governor Kane. Contrasted to Governor Cahill, who seemed to like the administrative side of the governorship much more, spent more time in the office. Subsequent governors, and Governor Byrne as well, spent more time out in the community and going around and speaking and doing that kind of thing. Governor Kane, and we can talk some more about that later, but is a patrician with a common touch. And he went around and liked interacting with people a great deal. I think he was very effective as a public speaker and had a good relationship with the legislators as a former legislator himself. So those were some of the differences among Governor Byrne and Cahill and Governor Kane.
Do you think Governor Byrne running today as a candidate would have any chance of election?
I would not. I would be hesitant to say that anybody would not have a chance because you never know. I think he could be an effective candidate for governor today. I think that his initial period when he was running, he and other people subsequent to him who ran didn't have the speaking skills that we would view as being necessary or desirable to be an effective candidate. But he certainly developed those skills over time.
And since he left office, Governor Byrne has become known for sort of reestablishing some very strong personal relationships with former opponents like Tom Kane and Ray Bateman. And I'd be interested in sort of your views in terms of the current sort of climate of partisan conflict and division compared to some of the older relationships which used to characterize New Jersey politics.
Well, I think it's today's politics are somewhat less congenial, less collegial than they used to be, and I think that personal relationships, which are always important, played a greater role, perhaps in the past than they do today. And I think, and I've taught public management courses at Rutgers in recent years, and I always tell my students that try to get to know the people who are working with you personally. And find out if they like to go fishing or like to play golf or whatever it might be, and sit down with them and have dinner with them, that kind of thing. And you can get over the rough spots and the difficulties and conflicts many times when you have those kind of personal relationships.
Mm-hmm. I think that'll do it for now. Any sort of closing thoughts that you want to make on the Byrne administration and Governor Byrne's legacy?
Well, I think Governor Byrne has a strong legacy of action, starting with the first term with the income tax, and which put the state on a much better fiscal basis, and then subsequently with the Pinelands legislation and other legislative initiatives in the second term. I think he'll go down as an effective governor, and he was charming and still is a charming and personally likable person as a public official.
Thank you.
Thank you.